I still walk those 50 yards every night in my dreams. My name is Jack Callahan, and I want to tell you what it's like to volunteer to walk first through a minefield. After the breakout from Normandy, we were chasing the Germans across France. It felt like victory was close, hanging in the air with the smell of apples from the roadside orchards. But that was a deception. The Germans were retreating, yes, but they weren't running. They were fighting back, and they were leaving gifts behind. Every bridge, every crossroads, every seemingly peaceful meadow could be a trap. Paranoia became our middle name. We stopped trusting the quiet. Quiet meant the enemy was waiting. Our platoon from the 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, was riding point. Our objective was to take a road junction codenamed Crossroads 212. It was a key position that controlled the road south. Recon had reported that the main German force had pulled back, leaving only a light screening force. Light screening force. We'd learned to hate that phrase. It usually meant a well-camouflaged anti-tank gun and a couple of machine gun nests ready to turn our walk into hell. We dismounted from our half-tracks and moved up along the edge of a thick forest. To our right, a field stretched out, an ordinary field covered in high grass with a few patches of daisies. It looked so peaceful, so domestic, you could almost forget there was a war on. About 100 yards ahead, we could see the junction. Between us and the objective lay this field. Lieutenant Graves made the call. We'd cut across the field to save time and catch the Germans by surprise. Going the long way around through the woods could take an extra hour, and we'd risk losing the element of surprise. We started to move out, 2 lines, 5 yards between each man. I was in the 2nd line, right behind Sergeant Rizzo, an old-timer who'd been through North Africa. Next to me was a kid named Peterson, green as grass, fresh from the States. This was his first real combat, and he was so nervous his canteen was banging against his hip in time with his steps. "Quiet, kid," Rizzo hissed without turning around. "You'll wake up every crowd in the county." Peterson flushed and pressed his canteen tight against his leg. We covered 10 yards, 20. The silence was absolute. Too absolute. No birds, no chirping crickets, just the rustle of grass under our boots and our own heavy breathing. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my spine. My fingers dug into the stock of my trusty M1 carbine. Something was wrong. This quiet was a trap. I could feel it in my bones. We were about halfway across the field when it happened. There was a sound, not a loud one, not an explosion, just a dry, distinct, metallic click. It came from the front line. Everyone who heard it froze instantly, like we'd been turned to pillars of salt. We all knew that sound. We'd heard it 100 times in training lectures. It was a sound we feared more than the whistle of a bullet or the scream of a shell. It was the sound of a pressure-activated mine. Someone had stepped on one. "Don't move!" Sergeant Rizzo's voice was like a gunshot. It was sharp, but you could hear the steel edge of panic in it. "Nobody move an inch!" We froze. Time stopped. I didn't dare breathe. I stared at the backs of the guys in front of me. Who? Which one? And then one of them, a kid named Miller, slowly, very slowly, turned his head. His face was white as a sheet. "Sergeant?" he whispered, and his whisper was audible in the dead silence. "Sergeant, it's me." Something clicked under my foot. We were trapped. We were standing in the middle of a field the Germans had generously sown with their devil's harvest. We didn't know where they were. We didn't know how many there were. Every next step could be our last, and in front of us stood our comrade, our friend, who had just become a living trigger. He was standing on a mine, and if he lifted his foot, it would go off. It was most likely an S-mine, what we called a bouncing Betty. When triggered, it jumped a yard into the air and sprayed hundreds of steel ball bearings in every direction. It was designed not just to kill, but to maim, to take out an entire squad in one go. And we were all standing in its kill zone. We were stuck, and I had no idea how we were going to get out of this hell alive. The silence that followed the click was as heavy as a tombstone. It felt like it was pressing down on our shoulders, forcing our heads into our collars. Every one of us, more than 30 men, was frozen in whatever position he was in when the sergeant's command came. One guy had his foot raised for a step. Another had his head turned. We'd become a gruesome wax museum in the middle of a French field. All eyes were fixed on Miller. He stood slightly bent over, his right foot pressed firmly to the ground, as if he feared the slightest shift in weight would set off the catastrophe. His face was a blank mask of pure, primal terror. "Easy, son, easy." Sergeant Rizzo's voice was surprisingly steady, but I could see a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. He was the closest to Miller. "Just don't move. We'll figure something out." Figure something out. The phrase just hung there. What was there to figure out? We knew these mines. The German engineers were diabolically clever. Try to disarm it? None of us was a combat engineer. That took special tools and nerves of steel. All we had were rifles and animal fear. Lieutenant Graves, a young kid straight out of West Point, tried to take charge. "Rizzo," he said, his voice cracking just a little. "Maybe we can slide something under his boot? Something heavy? To keep the plate down when he lifts his foot?" It wasn't a new idea. We'd heard about it in training. But it's one thing to hear about it, and another thing entirely to do it in the field, with your life and the lives of your buddies on the line. "With what, sir?" Rizzo asked hoarsely. "A pack. It's too light. We need a sandbag, and we ain't got one." They began to talk back and forth, their voices low and tense, and Miller just stood there. I could see a tremor run down his leg. He couldn't stand like that forever. Sooner or later, his muscles would give out. He'd shift his weight, and then... I tried not to think about the then. I looked at Peterson, standing next to me. His eyes were wide, and he was breathing in short, shallow gasps, like a cornered animal. Panic was in the air, so thick you could almost taste it, like morning fog. And then Miller spoke. His voice was surprisingly calm, as if he had already made a decision. "Sergeant, Lieutenant," he said, without turning his head. "It's no good. You know it." "Shut up, Miller," Rizzo barked. "Just stand still and shut up." "No, Sergeant. Listen," Miller went on. "Tell my mom. Tell her I wasn't scared. And say hi to Mary in Oklahoma for me. She'll know." "Miller, you stop that talk right now," the lieutenant yelled. But we all understood. He was saying goodbye. He was going to sacrifice himself to give us a chance, so we would at least know what to expect, and from where. There was no fear in his voice, just an endless weariness and a kind of grim resolve. He was going to lift his foot. "Hit the dirt!" Rizzo screamed. It was pure instinct. We fell to the ground, not thinking about what other mines might be beneath us. We just dropped, covering our heads with our arms. I went down flat on my stomach, squeezing my eyes shut so tight I saw red spots. I waited. That single second of waiting was more terrifying than anything I had ever experienced. The explosion wasn't like a shell. It was a dry, furious, and deafeningly loud blast. The ground beneath me shook. Something hot and sharp struck my helmet. And then there was a silence that was immediately pierced by screams. Someone was hit. Slowly, very slowly, I raised my head. The air was filled with the smell of burnt explosive and fresh earth. Where Miller had been standing, there was now nothing. An empty space, as if he'd been erased. The bouncing Betty had done its job. The panic we'd been holding back broke loose. "Back! Get back!" someone yelled. And that was the worst possible thing that could have happened. Peterson, the green kid, scrambled to his feet. His eyes were wild with terror. "I don't want to die," he shrieked and started to run, back the way we came. "Peterson, stop, you idiot!" Rizzo roared, but it was too late. Peterson took 3 steps. On the 4th, there was another explosion. This one was muffled from under the ground. A pressure plate anti-personnel mine. The kid was thrown into the air and collapsed onto the ground like a broken doll. That was it, the breaking point. The platoon was paralyzed. No one dared to move. We were lying or sitting on the ground, afraid to even breathe. Lieutenant Graves was trying to give orders, but his voice was cracking. "Nobody move! Wait for the engineers!" Wait for the engineers? They were miles back with the main column. We could be waiting here until dark. And what if the Germans who laid this field were watching us right now? What if they were just waiting for us to bunch up before plastering us with mortars? We were a perfect target. I lay on the ground, my mind racing. Fear was a vice, but somewhere beneath it, a cold anger was burning. Anger at the Germans, at this damned war, at our own helplessness. We couldn't just lie here. Lying here was a slow death. We had to move, but how? There was no going back. We'd just seen that. That meant the only way was forward. But who would go? Who would take that first step after what we'd just seen? I looked at Sergeant Rizzo. He was sitting on the ground, his head in his hands. The old soldier was broken. Lieutenant Graves was looking around, lost. He didn't know what to do. There was no page in the field manual for this, and I realized there was no point in waiting for an order. There was no command anymore. There was only fear. And that's when I made my decision. I wasn't a hero. I was just another 20-year-old kid scared to death like everyone else. But I understood one simple thing. The fear of moving was great, but the fear of doing nothing was even greater. I unclipped my bayonet. Its blade gave a dull glint in the sun. I knew what I had to do. They'd taught us this. It was called probing, a slow, agonizingly meticulous and dangerous process. But it was the only chance we had. Slowly, trying not to make any sudden moves, I got to my knees. All eyes turned to me. In the silence, the sound of my own breathing was deafening. I looked at the lieutenant. "Sir," I said, and my voice was surprisingly steady. "Waiting is death. Request permission to try and find a path." The lieutenant just stared at me, uncomprehending. I held up my bayonet. "I'll go first." The world shrank to 6 inches of steel in my hand and a square foot of earth in front of me. The moment I got on my knees to start, everything else ceased to exist. There was no platoon behind me, no German positions ahead. There was only the tall grass, the damp soil, and my bayonet. I made the first probe. They'd taught us how. Don't stab straight down. You could hit the detonator. You had to push the blade into the ground at a low angle, maybe 30 degrees. Slow, very slow, feeling for the slightest change in resistance. Soft and yielding was a root. A hard scrape was a rock. But something hard, smooth, with an unnatural shape, that would be death. Every jab of the bayonet was a question I was terrified to hear the answer to. I cleared a small patch directly in front of me, inch by inch. Clear. Now I had to move forward. I didn't stand. I got on my belly and low-crawled those few inches into the cleared space. Then I got on my knees again, and I started the painstaking, devilish ritual all over. Probe, Advance. Probe. Advance. My shirt was soaked with sweat. The sun beat down on the back of my neck. A fly buzzed annoyingly by my ear, and I wanted to scream, but I held it in. Any sudden sound, any sharp movement, felt like a sacrilege in this deadly quiet. I covered 5 yards. It probably took 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. And then I found one. My bayonet touched something hard, not a rock. The impact was dull, without a scraping sound. And the shape. It was round. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I carefully traced the outline with the tip of my knife. This was it. An anti-personnel pressure mine, the same kind that had killed Peterson. It was buried just 2 inches below the surface. I didn't try to disarm it. I slowly pulled the bayonet out. Then I took the white handkerchief from my pocket that my mother had given me before I shipped out. I tore off a strip and carefully laid it on the grass next to where the mine was. It was a marker, the first marker on our path to salvation. I went around it to the right, probing every inch, and I moved on. Behind me, I heard movement. I glanced back. Sergeant Rizzo, with Lieutenant Graves right behind him, had started to follow. They were crawling, following my exact path, trace for trace. Behind them, one by one, the others began to move. Our platoon had turned into a long, slithering snake, with me as the head, and the tail still back where the disaster had struck. They had trusted me with their lives. The thought didn't give me strength. It settled on my shoulders like an impossible weight. The price of my mistake had just increased 30-fold. I found another one, and another. The Germans hadn't bothered with a pattern. They'd just scattered them randomly, which made the field even more treacherous. I marked each mine with a strip of white cloth. My handkerchief was quickly gone, so I started tearing up my undershirt. Those white flags on the green grass looked like strange, sinister flowers, marking our path through the valley of death. We were halfway across. The tension was almost unbearable. The silence was crushing. All we could hear was the rustle of grass and our own breathing. And then the silence exploded. It wasn't a mine. It was the dry, furious rip of an MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw. They had opened fire. Bullets hissed angrily over our heads. The Germans, dug in at the crossroads, had obviously realized what was happening. They saw us slowly but surely crossing their trap, and they decided to stop us. "Suppressive fire!" Lieutenant Graves yelled. A few of the guys farther back returned fire, shooting blindly toward the crossroads. But it was useless. We were exposed, and they were in cover. I hit the dirt, pressing my body flat against it. A machine gun burst, stitched the ground a couple of feet away from me. I was the closest man. I was the most obvious target, and for that very reason, I had the best view. I could see where they were firing from. The nest was camouflaged in a hedgerow right by the road. I could see the muzzle flashes. They were no more than 30 yards away, but there was still a minefield between us. I couldn't shoot. I had to move. Faster. It was a race now, me against their bullets. Adrenaline surged through me, drowning out the fear. I worked the bayonet with a frantic speed, no longer as careful as before. The risk was worth it. Doing nothing was death for all of us. 20 yards to the edge of the field, 15, 10. The bullets were whipping by so low I felt like they were cutting the grass off my back. I heard someone cry out behind me. They were starting to pick us off. 5 yards. I could see the safety of a ditch at the edge of the field. And then my knife hit metal again. Another one, the last one. It was directly in my path to cover. And that's when I made my second decision of the day. I didn't mark it. I just remembered where it was. I crawled the last few feet, going around it, and tumbled into the ditch. I was safe, on solid, reliable, safe ground. I could have stayed there, caught my breath, waited for the others, but I didn't. I jumped to my feet, turned to face the field, to face my guys who were still out there, under fire. "This way!" I roared, yelling over the chatter of the machine gun. "Rizzo, Lieutenant, straight to me. Follow my path. It's clear to the left of the last flag." Then I turned toward the machine gun nest, raised my carbine, braced the stock against my bruised shoulder, and opened fire. I wasn't trying to kill them. I was just shooting, keeping their heads down, buying my guys precious seconds. They crossed the field one by one, diving into the ditch beside me. Filthy, terrified, but alive. When the last of the survivors had made it to cover, we weren't just a scattered group of scared soldiers anymore. We were a fighting unit. "Callahan, you son of a bitch!" Rizzo breathed, clapping me on the back. "All guns on that nest!" the lieutenant commanded. We unleashed a storm of lead. Under the cover of our fire, 2 guys with a Browning automatic rifle were able to get into position and hit the Germans from the flank. 5 minutes later, it was over. Crossroads 212 was ours. Later, as we sat in that ditch, tending to the wounded and counting our dead, Lieutenant Graves came over to me. He just silently held out his flask. I took a long swallow. The whiskey burned my throat. "Callahan," he said, "what you did today." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. I wasn't a hero. Miller was the hero. He faced death with dignity. I was just a guy who was more afraid of dying on my belly than I was of dying on my feet. That 50-yard walk didn't make me fearless. Far from it. I learned what true fear was. But I also learned that sometimes the only way through hell is to go first, one step at a time, even when any one of those steps could be your last.